Thank you very much, Zara, and for the brilliant organization. And I'm really excited about this event. So my name is Raul. I'm a director of Cambridge Spark, a specialist data science and AI training provider. Really excited to have a fantastic panel today, which I'll have everyone introduce themselves very shortly. The topic is AI for the many or for the few, and I'll describe in more details what that means. But let's get started with some short introductions. So hi, Monica.
Hello, Raul, and thank you to you and to Zara for the invitation to join. My background is really within sort of consumer and publishing, the creative industries and higher education. I'll hold off explaining what my real interest in AI is until you pose that question. Anything else you want to find out about me, you can see on LinkedIn. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica. And hi, Mark.
Hello. I'm Mark Bishop. Currently work as scientific advisor to a new startup called Fact360, who are deploying AI and natural language processing for fraud detection in large legal cases internationally. I'm also a Professor Emeritus of Cognitive Computing at Goldsmiths, University of London, and a member of the international faculty at the Karel Capek Center in Prague, Czech Republic. I'm trying to keep it brief. At Goldsmiths, I led teams as part of a center I set up called the Center for Intelligent Data Analytics that deployed AI to do price analytics and HR analytics, and quite famously we used it to benchmark the pricing of NHS consumables in around 2010, where we had a headline figure of £500 million in annual savings our software identified, and at that time I thought it would be the one-man saviour of the NHS, until I learned that price is only one factor that people take into account when they make purchasing decisions. I'm very interested in cognitive science and how the brain thinks, and I've been working in AI for around 40 years, which is over half the time there's actually been a subject of AI.
Thank you, Mark. We'll pick your brain very shortly. So next, hi, John.
Hello, I'm John McClune. I'm at Wolfram Research, where we've spent the last 30 years building technology for computation, data science, and AI. And one of the roles I particularly do is I lead a technical services team where we do data science projects for outside organizations. So that's pretty discipline agnostic. We've done work in energy, aerospace, finance, and health. But within health, we're involved in projects right now on detecting colon cancer from pill cams, diagnosing Alzheimer's disease, and past projects have included things like figuring out the causes for slips, trips, and falls in hospitals, and optimizing cancer pathways in London.
Wonderful, thank you very much, John. And Guy, hello.
Hi, Roland. Hello, everyone. I'm Guy. I run charisma.ai, which is applying interactive storytelling to AI and vice versa. We tend to work with large TV broadcasters in the UK and around the world, from Sky, BBC here, and then a number in the US as well. So my focus here is on that great intersection between the creative industries and storytelling and AI. I also am chair of a theatre in Oxford, so I've got interest in that side. And we recently announced a collaborative AI consortium with Oxford University, Falmouth University, and various others, to make sure that the creative industry's voices are heard in influencing the direction of the technology as it's developed.
Thank you very much, guys. So we have an amazing panel with really rich experience and a range of backgrounds. So hopefully that's going to be a nice discussion. So to set the scene, so clearly we are all really excited about AI and the prospects of AI. In UK, we even have an office for AI, right? So clearly everyone believes in what AI can do for us. Now, if I take the other view, it looks like actually only the very powerful companies are able to deploy AI, the likes of Google and Facebook. So it just raised the question of whether it's something that is only in the remit of large organizations. Perhaps AI actually has failed us. There is a lot of mistrust in algorithms or AI, and it's in the news. I think in the last couple of weeks, There's been a lot of actions in Australia. So I think it's really relevant around the use of data and the monopoly that some companies have. So it does raise the question, is AI for the many, for everyone, or for the few? So that's going to be really the guiding topic for today's panel. And excitingly, the UK AI Council published a roadmap in January, which actually provides some recommendations and views on what should be done with AI in UK. There are 4 themes which I would like to cover today. So those are research, development, and innovation. That's the first theme. Skills and diversity. That's the second theme. Data, infrastructure, and trust, which I suspect is going to be quite a nice hot debate, is the third theme. And then fourth, more broadly, national collaboration and adopting AI across different sectors. So in today's panel, we'll try and give each of these themes equal attention, just so that we can cover the full picture. Now, if you have any questions at any point, please ask them in the Zoom chat. My role today is a facilitator, so I'm going to engage the panel and make sure we can pick everyone's brains to understand everyone's perspectives. And if you've got questions, I can see them in a separate chat, and I'll do my best to bring them up in front of the panel. So without further ado, let's get started. So as I said, we all talk about AI, so it's really exciting, but why does it matter, really? So maybe, Monica, why don't we start with you? Why does AI matter, do you think?
I mean, I think from my perspective, when I sort of think about this, it's more as somebody who's not essentially technical, really. I'm not from an AI background. It's really, for me, why AI matters now. I mean, John just said, he's sort of worked 40 years with an AI. And this has been around for decades, but we know that the technology is there. We know that absolutely it is going fast, or almost moving unnaturally fast in a sense. But from my point of view, the reason it matters is threefold to me personally. The first is about mindsets. And by mindsets, I mean specifically boardroom mindsets. And that is the crucial need for board members to be involved across this topic. And moving them from being what I would say is tech curious to being tech savvy, with almost an understanding that the exec is tech fluent. And that is linked to ethics, the questions we ask, the way in which we surface insights, competitiveness, and where the boundaries of acceptability lie. Which, if you're on the board of Facebook or any of these companies, it's something where you hold the mirror up to yourself. And I think actually in a small organization for an SME, when you are close to the gunfire, the role that you play as a board advisor, which is what I primarily do, versus the large corporates, a quite different experience. The second aspect of why I'm particularly interested in why AI matters and matters now is what I think around the skills and cognitive diversity elements, and those responsible for the teaching and learning agenda, alongside continuing professional development. Whether you are a regulator, whether you are in business, I don't think it really matters whether you are in the public sector. And then I think the third aspect for me, which is probably the most challenging of all, is hearts and minds. Is the hearts and minds of consumers, and how we get people on board with an AI when there is much of this that we cannot control, but we certainly can control how we respond to things that are not in our control, related also to truth and authenticity. So those are really the key areas of why it really matters to me and matters to me now.
Thanks, Monica. Some great themes that you've highlighted. So governance, skills, trust. So we'll pick up on those points today. So maybe Guy, so given your experience with startups, SMEs, and within the creative industry, I think you bring like a fresh perspective on why AI matters. So how is it relevant to you?
Well, to begin with, we used it because we wanted to build a platform that told stories, that we could create stories in the format that we wanted. It was that simple. So to begin with, natural language processing was a means to an end. We'd tried using IBM Watson a few years back, and it just didn't work for us because it's very much built for corporates, and we wanted to build ours for storytelling. So we built this platform. But I think what's more interesting is that what's happened since then. We've sort of been drawn into the debate. We've been drawn in because the creative industries have been brought into it by the large tech companies. So let's take, I don't know, a couple of examples. The museum sector, for example. So Google goes in and they do the Street View capturing of museums. That's wonderful and seems like a way to get more people to see artwork. Except if you look closely at that screen, and you can do it after this, you'll see a little copyright Google at the bottom, which means they're going in and they're owning the copyright of it. So that's not sort of the creative industries saying anything. That's the tech companies going, hi, we sort of own this. And similarly, as some of you may know, there was a significant legal battle that ran for a few years and resolved in 2015. It was mainly around 2015 in the US between the Writers Guild in the US and Google around scanning books. And I was doing a fellowship in 2019 with Southwest content technology groups on automation, and was looking into this as to query what content was being used in this sort of scanning process. And what I was specifically keen to know was whether Google had been using copyrighted material to train its AI. Now, as far as I could see, there is evidence that it has, but almost it's a moot point, because what the law courts came down saying was it doesn't matter, because what you're doing is you're transforming. It's transformative. So we're taking these books and we're transforming them into AI. So the laws of copyright don't really matter. And I figure, maybe that's why we talk a lot about ethics around AI, because what it dawns on me is that ethics is sort of what the law should be, but hasn't got around to being yet. It allows us to think about things without it being brought into a court of law. And ethically and morally, which are two words obviously often used interchangeably, that seems to me wrong. That these industries can be plundered in this way, especially something like the creative industries, which is so important to humanity and our soul and our happiness. And yet it's a very fragile industry. It is not Wall Street. It is not big business. It is groups of individuals who do not have those sorts of financial recourses. And then finally, just to tip it off, I think as AI, is applied to art in this and poetry and theatre, and it is, I would be remiss not to point out that tomorrow it is the 100th anniversary of the invention of the word robot, which was in a Czech play, which is about to be put on as a sort of shameless plug, although I've got nothing to do with it, by a Czech company on the 26th. And that play, by the way, the script has been written by AI, as one might imagine. So, we have thought about these things, but a lot of it is that, if AI cannot create a Rembrandt, it simply can't. A Rembrandt is a Rembrandt by definition. It's a moot point. But the question more to me is, should it even try? Aren't there better things that we should be doing than trying to put painters and artists and so forth sort of out of a job, recognizing that there were significant machinations behind the scenes of the art world in that particular issue. So my feeling is that we haven't really, I personally have been drawn into this debate, but the more I go into it and the deeper I go in, I'm more sort of ethically strong. I feel that the creative industries should actually be setting a direction for and a moral direction for AI. And it should not be set by large businesses.
Got it. Thank you, guys. So clearly a really passionate topic close to your heart. So let me actually, John, let me ask you a provocative question, which is kind of like a follow-up on the guys' thinking, right? So of course, like, why does AI matter to you, given that you have more of a commercial views, given you've been working on several projects, but is AI really an opportunity or is it a risk? Clearly in the creative industry, it seems like potentially it's, it's both, but I feel like guys seeing more as a risk. So what's your view, John?
Yeah, I see it principally as an opportunity. I'd like to start by slightly de-hyping it and saying it's just a tool for making predictions. And we've been doing those kinds of that kind of thing for many, many years. It's just a new way of doing it. Why it's important is that it's partly that it's particularly useful for fuzzy problems, which makes it apply to very much practical problems that were very human-like in the past, that we didn't have alternative methods to. So, you know, what's it similar to, and is this unusual? Or more creative things like create something similar to. These are all much fuzzier and therefore practical human-like things, not kind of obscure specialist academic questions. So it's made it very applicable to things that we actually care about on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of this is about timing, that because it's a brand new tool where it's not replacing a better one, it's actually doing something that we didn't really have tools for before. We're in a position that we were, for example, when the microscope was invented, where all you had to do was point it at something that hadn't been looked at before, and you made discoveries. And there was low-hanging fruit just waiting to be picked off. And we're at that point in timing now that we've got this tool, and every time you point it at a new data set, there are easy discoveries to make. And maybe in 5, 10, 15 years, that won't be true anymore, and it'll only be the hard to tackle problems that are left. But right now, it's a kind of golden age of easy wins by just taking a new tool and applying it. And part of that timing is that we've been accumulating the fuel of AI for years, building up this kind of bonfire of material in the form of data. That data collection has been going much longer than practical AI tools. And so we've got this bonfire, and now we've got the match to light it, that we've got the kind of fuel ready to just go back and plow through. And, you know, some of the projects that I did, the one I mentioned about slips, trips, and falls, that wasn't even the question. The hospital had a bunch of data that it had collected over 10 years for operational reasons, and no one had ever looked at it to see if there was something interesting there. And they just came to us and said, tell us something interesting. And finding out why people fell over on the wards was the most interesting thing that we found out of that. But, you know, that could have been anything hidden in that data. The data is just waiting to be looked at. It's worth saying as well that you know, there's a lot of the ethics and fear comes from the idea that it's going to be smarter than us, and I don't see that anywhere near on our horizon. It's artificial, but it's not intelligent. It's pretty dumb. It just happens to be doing something useful. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, that it still brings us things like scale and reproducibility. So even if it's doing a worse job for humans for many things for years to come, the fact that it can do that in a fraction of a second over and over again and make the same decision each time you ask it to look is itself useful. So in terms of risks, you know, there are challenges. To pick up Monica's point, boards need to learn new skills. That for years we've known how to manage people, because there are management skills that you have to learn, but fundamentally we come equipped with some of those because we know how to deal with people. So when you manage people who do a skilled job that you don't have the skills to do yourself, we still have some skills to manage the people. There's a new skill now, which is how do we manage the AI when we don't know how it works, we don't know what it's doing, and we don't have the human intuition to know when it looks like it's lying to us. We've got that new set of skills to learn, and that's a fresh frontier for education. And of course, there are risks to jobs, but I'm not scared of that. I consider that a good thing, that our entire human race has been about destroying jobs. All of our technology destroys jobs. When the first farmer put a fence around their crops and their cows, the hunter-gatherers said, what do I do now? And we've been doing that over and over again throughout history. So taking away jobs that are a waste of human time and freeing the humans to do higher level, more interesting things is a good thing. The only bad thing about it is when you get these mass changes in one go, because gradual evolution is fine. When one job goes, there's 1,000 people in the country they move on and find other jobs. When you wipe out an entire industry, like when the cotton looms came along and replaced weavers, and we have the risk of doing that to, say, the entire world of taxi drivers and truck drivers almost overnight, then we've got a transition risk. But that doesn't make it a fundamentally bad thing. It's just we need to plan for those transitions and find those new interesting jobs that didn't exist before that these people can do. Really
interesting, John. Quite a lot to deconstruct from what you said, including skills, which we'll come back to. So I think one of the interesting points you made is, we've got a new shiny tool. There's opportunities. AI offers scalability, offers speed. So there are opportunities to grab. It's interesting you say that, because I often hear also that actually it's really hard to leverage AI, to actually deploy projects that make use of AI. There's quite a a long delay, and it requires a lot of skill set, new practices, and so on. So maybe Mark, I'll pull you in for a bit, and then I'll give Daniel the voice. So Mark, you've clearly have a lot of experience in the industry, in academia. What's your perspective on AI? Can it add value really quickly and easily, or it's a complex beast? What are your views on that?
I guess if we position the birth of AI with Alan Turing's first program to play chess back in 1948, then the subject's 73 years old. And as I mentioned, I've been working in it for over 40 years. And over that time, I've seen fashions and fads come and go. But at the moment, hype is really high. Why is that? And I think we've got a number of reasons why this is happening. We've got the availability now of phenomenally powerful computers. As important, if not more important, huge access to solid state memory. And the science of AI, the development of interesting AI algorithms has moved on a lot. Most notably in one particular branch of AI that we call artificial neural networks, which is an engineering attempt to model certain aspects of neuronal processing in the brain. We've had a number of big developments in the last 2 decades, most notably a field of neural computing that's become known as so-called deep learning. And when we kind of throw, for want of a better word, these deep learning neural network systems at quite complicated problems. I mean, I'm thinking here, for example, of machine translation and NLP, natural language processing. We've achieved some quite spectacular results. So AI is effectively coming out of the lab. When I started, it was the domain of a few geeks like myself, launched over a PDP-8 or PDP-11 mini computer. Now anybody with a phone can access AI, and that's quite a large percentage of the world's population these days, and can play with AI systems. So it's been democratized in that sense. But there's a sense in which AI hasn't been democratized, because to do the really big projects in AI, and I'm thinking of the really big language models like GPT-3, we need massive data sets and massive crunch power of the sort that just is not available to the proverbial woman and man on the street. So there's a sense that AI, the algorithms have become widely known. We've all got access to computers. So in that sense, the science is more democratic than it was when I began my journey through AI in the late 70s. But in the other sense, it's become more professionalized and become more commercialized by huge corporations, because to really monetize the really cutting edge of what's going on in AI, you need supercomputing power and massive data sets. And in fact, some have argued that the access to these data sets is becoming like the new oil. So for example, those people working on the buy side in the city, they will just literally buy up huge sources of data. They might not have the tech yet to extract value from that data, but they've realized that getting access to data can give them leverage down the line to make better economic judgments on what products to buy and sell. And I'll throw you in an anecdote that made me sit back and think when it was expressed to me at a conference at the buy side a few years back. And that was one company was buying up very high detailed satellite images of the world. Why were they doing that, given that they're into trading commodities? Well, what they were doing is quite incredible, but with modern neural networks, you can take images of the oceans, find where the ships are on the oceans, know what ships they are, what cargo they've got, and see how heavy they are in the water. And that gives you an estimate of where cargo is moving around the world. And if you're making money by futures selling on the price of wheat or oil or something like that, that knowledge can give you a real advantage. And so we find the strange position of people developing so-called data lakes, huge masses of uninterpreted data that they think they might not be able to interpret it now, but 5 or 10 years down the line, the AI will come to add value to those data lakes. So that's kind of all now, that's the sort of sexy everyday image that people want to take away from AI, the sort of image that you would sell to your CEO or your board to invest in AI. I'd like to wear another hat now and critique that, because it seems to me that AI's made, from my perspective, enormous progress over the last 40 years at developing very sophisticated solutions to very, very narrow problem domains. But I haven't really seen much progress in the so-called world of artificial general intelligence, how we can seamlessly transfer knowledge from one domain into another, the sort of intelligence that all of us on the panel and everybody in the audience thinks is almost their second nature. The thing that effectively kind of makes us human. And I have yet to see much significant progress in that area. And this foregrounds two questions which I'm going to leave with you for this moment in the debate. One, is it the case that every task that a human can turn their hand to is theoretically computable in some sense? Can we develop an algorithm for everything that which a human can do? So that's, is every task, does it have an AI solution, if you like? And I think that question is still an open question in the literature. And the second question, even if that was possible, can we develop this so-called artificial general intelligence that can seamlessly transfer knowledge from one domain to another so that you haven't got to laboriously build new models for every problem to which you wish to apply artificial intelligence?
Thank you, Mark. So really interesting, because what I'm hearing so far from the panel is a lot of concerns, a lot of questions, which is great. So let's look at tackling some of them. So Daniel, I'm glad you could join us. So building up on Mark's thinking on the specific point around large compute, large resources, it seems like the latest advancements require big investments only accessible to the very few. So what's the perspective for startups? How can startups compete? How can they use AI to be successful? What's your view on that, Daniel?
Brilliant, thank you, Raoul. If you don't mind, I'll just introduce myself very quickly and apologise for getting on late. I came in just as I think it was Mark was saying, it's 100 years since the invention of the robot. Was it 73 years since Turing's initial paper on AI? And we've been in lockdown for a year, and we still struggle with connecting to Zoom meetings. Or at least I do. My name's Daniel Clark. I'm the head of applied sciences at Adaga, but I have quite an interesting career in that my PhD was in astrophysics, and then I went to work for the UK MOD for DSTL, working on surveillance topics. Thoroughly enjoyed that, but went to work in autonomous driving and did that at a number of companies, including Siemens. And I've recently joined Adaga as the head of applied science, understanding how we apply natural language processing to the task of integrating lots of data together and deriving knowledge from those big data lakes that John was just talking about. Building on this, and this is really interesting, because I think there was a question on, is artificial intelligence a fad? And I'm going to touch on a point that I heard last year, so it's not my point. And the point was that artificial intelligence acts as an accelerant for all technologies. And the side which is going to be successful will be the side that applies that technology with the most elegant and effective solution. And I actually think that that's really true. And I'm going to give a bit of an anecdote here. So just a few weeks ago, my boss, Rob, came to me and he said, Dan, I've read about this fantastic application of graph technology. So it's clustering graph technology using DB-scan. And it was quite ironic because DB-scan is an algorithm I've used throughout my career, right? So we use it or we could use it in Adaga with our graph technology, to cluster graph technology. We used it in autonomous driving to do clustering of LiDAR points, unsupervised learning of LiDAR points to detect objects. In my astrophysics PhD, I used it to detect over densities of galaxies so that we could infer how galaxies and stars form in the early universe. And actually, you trace the algorithm back, and it goes back to the 80s when some of the theory about dark matter was just starting to come out. So answering that question, is artificial intelligence a fad, and is it here to stay? It's not a fad, it's here to stay. It's going to act as an accelerant for everything. But then moving on to this question of, do you need to be on a hypercloud architecture in order to be successful? And I'm gonna be a really good scientist and sit absolutely on the fence here, because it really depends on your application. If you're trying to do a very large scale data intensive task, then absolutely the cloud helps to accelerate you. So being able to sort of deploy hyperscale solutions for this allows you to accelerate faster than your adversaries or your competitors. And so, yeah, this is, I think, really important, because that access gives you access to large compute. It gives you access to large data. And I believe GPT-3 was mentioned. If I'm going off the top of my head, I think it's something like 2 trillion words that are used in that data set. And if you think that War and Peace has about 200,000 words in, that's a lot of copies of War and Peace, right? I couldn't fit those in my home, let alone on my local computer. So how do you store that data? How do you ensure that that data set has that range of diversity that is needed for all of these very interesting applications? But because I'm sitting on the fence, I want to give the other side as well, in that artificial intelligence is a set of mathematical algorithms, which is not just about the big, large problems that we're trying to solve. Is you can solve some very specific problems very elegantly and very efficiently. So, the answer there is very much, if you want to solve big problems with big data, then yes, big access to big compute and big storage is really important. But we can apply artificial intelligence, the techniques and methodologies, to other areas.
Thank you, Daniel. So I'll just, it's interesting, of course, AI has been around for a long time, so it's not new. So it's here to stay. I guess the difference is larger data, compute available, some latest innovation, which makes it more exciting today. So John, I'm going to pull you in, and then Monica, after that, I'll bring you in for skills and diversity. So John, in the roadmap by the UK AI Council, there's a recommendation around moonshots projects. So now we're in the research, development, and innovation theme. So how, as an organization, do you balance out moonshot projects, which are high risk, can fail, require investments, versus maybe boring projects that deliver commercial outcome and prove that AI is actually adding value to the business? So where do you see the balance, and what should leaders do?
Well, you set out to some extent in some of the introduction that there are the big brands doing serious AI, but really it's down to picking the task that's appropriate for your size. So if there is a moonshot type project, and some of them certainly are moonshot type projects, they're going to take millions and millions of dollars, and they might fail. And that in the end has to be for the big tech, the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, or government funded support. But there's an awful lot of non-moonshot problems that actually are very, very accessible to the many. That and I kind of feel like where we are with AI is the same kind of cycle you go through with new industries generally. That if you look back at the car industry, at the beginning, when it was being invented, very few people knew what to do. And then you get this kind of little golden age where there were hundreds of car companies around the world. Anyone who had a couple of panel beaters and some engineers could get the tool set they needed to put an engine in a car and make a car company. And we're kind of like that phase at the moment with AI, that you can rent compute power. For the first time in history, I can have 1,000 computers and rent them for an hour. I don't have to raise hundreds of millions of dollars to set up that cluster. I can just go to the likes of Amazon and access that cheaply. The tool set, just as in the early car engineering days, you get this kind of start getting off-the-shelf tools that become very accessible. We within Mathematica have a kind of auto machine learning that you just need to wrap the word classify around your data and it makes predictions. You're not going to get the 99.999% accurate that you would need for a self-driving car with those kinds of completely automated tools. But there are a lot of problems where 70, 80%, 90% prediction rates are really useful. So if you pick the problems where you have the data, you don't need more than a few hundred compute clusters to be able to operate on, and you don't have that very high expertise level end of the accuracy, then it's really very, very accessible. Where it gets difficult is when either the level of quality is needed, and just like cars, we're now at the point where in order to compete with a BMW for the performance of its engine, you need really serious technology and expertise. And you couldn't imagine starting, unless you're Elon Musk, you couldn't imagine starting a car company from scratch now, because you're so far behind both in tech and in brand. So we'll move towards a point where it's going to be owned by big companies, even if just for branding reasons. You could build a Facebook clone with a few engineers in a couple of weeks, but who's going to use it? That one's been won on a branding level. But that's not the point we're at the moment. I think it really is available to the many right now, if you pick your battles wisely and leave the big moonshots to governments and Facebooks of the world.
Interesting. Before I move on to skill, Monica, I don't know if Mark, Daniel, or Guy, if you've got a follow-up to that. It sounds like actually moonshots reserved for the larger players, and then for everybody, let's focus on the tangible projects with commercial outcomes. Is that how you see it?
I'm interested in sort of whether we should. It's the old Jeff Goldblum line out of Jurassic Park. Just because we can, should we? I think it is interesting. The battle, as you mentioned, Raoul, between Facebook and the Australian government is an interesting one, and for a bunch of geopolitical reasons as well. But I suppose more specifically for this, there's a debate I've been having recently as a conversation between whether or not OpenAI running GPT-3 should be the sole custodian of that GPT-3 sort of concept, and indeed should it release all of the data sources. And as you might know, there is another option to that emerging called Eleuther, where they have released the data source as open source, and they are looking to do that. There is a significant question. I confess I don't know the answer to this as to sort of whether one is right or wrong, or whether there's somewhere in between, because arguably GPT-3 is an incredibly powerful tool for misinformation and for anything else that someone might want to turn their mind to. And one could argue that having it under a sort of corporate governance of someone like Microsoft might keep it safer. But the trade-offs to that are, I think, the sorts of trade-offs that we've seen in the Facebook versus Australian government argument. So I confess I think it's very much an evolving debate. What my single point that I go back to the beginning is that I think we need to have this debate out in the open and very clearly and unbounded by previous thinking. And it's not necessarily to do with AI as a concept. It's to do with the ubiquity of the impact of it across so many different sectors, that we need to have people sort of collaborating a lot more together, and showing the power of what can be done with it, because that will then allow everyone to understand what it can be used for.
Thank you, guys. So I guess to bring it to skills, because that's the second theme on the agenda. So to build on what John and Guy said. So clearly, we live in a complex world now, right? You have to think about models. I think, John, you mentioned different sort of metrics to think about. There's the impact that AI is going to have on the business and people, which leaves the question of education, especially for leaders, but also for a board or for universities, higher education for the people, for everyone. So Monica, what's you bring the perspective of the governance. So what should be done to educate senior leaders? What's the place of higher institution now that we're dealing with this complexity? What's your view?
So it's a great question, Raoul, and I certainly think from a business perspective, if you're fortunate to be big enough, then you can access some of the excellence director briefings and the learnings targeted at you by the big four accounting firms, and even the layers below, law firms, professional advisory firms are excellent at that. But I think if you're smaller, or an SME or what have you, actually it can be quite difficult for people to know where to look for this stuff. And I think a lot of the bodies who would typically advise organisations have really struggled in this last year, which is not particularly helpful when actually you need them most. I think that from a higher education perspective, having just stepped down from Queen Mary University London as deputy chair of the board there, I'm delighted and so proud of the work that they're doing in AI, and in fact with Zara and the team, the IMAI. But the one thing I do think is I think higher education needs to reimagine the future for us. I think it has a fundamental role in terms of not just being seen in its ivory towers. And I'm afraid that is still the view for a lot of people. And I think linked to that is lifelong learning and this notion that people need to go through their careers and see AI as an evolution, to John's earlier point, but actually for many it is a revolution, because at a very basic level, the narrative that plays out to people is fear. It's a human emotion of this is going to change my job, or, ever stand and go to the supermarket and just stand quietly just for a bit by the kiosks and see the amount of people who will say, well, I won't go to the kiosk because, they're taking away jobs. But actually, if we don't play back the narrative, which is actually it's enabling our, partners at John Lewis or whatever it is, or at Waitrose or what have you, to go in and, mingle with the customers or whatever it is that they do, then actually we allow people to have those mental models and to shape the stories. So in a sense, the same way that Guy has referenced storytelling, I think we in positions of leadership here need to think about the stories that we tell people. We need to think about why we should encourage them to learn, and they need to be given the access to that training, because I'm afraid even at a basic level of part-time education, that has fallen away in this country. And I think there has to be the learning agenda at the highest level. There has to be people like the CBI, the IOD, the big advisory firms and what have you, linked to the incentives that government provide. And then that filters through. Then that goes through to higher education. And I think it says in the AI Council roadmap that every student should leave university with an understanding of what AI is and what AI isn't, as opposed to just the predictive algorithms that screws up the A-level results. And by the way, that's the story that everybody knows. And then bring it back down to education. When you're younger, and these young people, they are native, they are born into it. So give them the tools that they need early on. And I have to say, I'd be more ambitious than the roadmap. Because the one thing I do think about, as I was thinking about this debate today, is, we have moved to this digital world. Why not have brilliant academics or leaders giving the virtual classroom to students, right, across the country? Look at David Attenborough, the way he has led on climate. Look at Brian Cox. Alex Ferguson comes out of Manchester United and gets paid a bomb to teach at LBS and Harvard. Why can't we do something like that in the same way and teach young people? Because actually you can play back stories. It's not only what you learn, it's not only how you learn, it's who you learn it from. So actually I'm going to argue that the roadmap needs to be more ambitious.
Thank you, Monica. So I think I need to give the voice to Mark Bishop on this one, given I'm sure you have some strong views here.
Well, firstly, I think education is engaging and becoming more democratic, and particularly in the field of ML and AI, machine learning and artificial intelligence. One of the first, and indeed the most popular of the large online multi-user educational platforms is the machine learning course taught by Andrew Ng at Stanford. This allows anybody to engage with one of the top 5 ML people in the world and do a Stanford accredited course in ML. Anyone who's got the brain power can engage and do that. And when I used to work in academia, I recommended all my new postgrads sat that course before engaging with their wider interests. So I think, to answer Monica's point, there's a degree to which high quality teaching from the very best people in the world is now available if you can want to reach out and engage with that. Where I think there's still a little bit of a lack, and it's certainly debates on this can be found if you probe the darker regions of the internet, is a critical appraisal of what AI can do. And when we mentioned hype earlier on, I do think there's a tendency for people to too easily get sucked in with the claims from the big tech companies and the big AI vendors about what their systems can do. So that it's been mentioned a couple of times. So let's look at GPT-3. It's rubbish. It can do natural language, some aspects of natural language processing very well, but there's a world of difference between natural, comes back to John's point about in industry, getting something that gives you a 70-80%, so that a solution 70 or 80% of the time is good enough. I absolutely endorse that. But if you're talking, this is the difference between natural language processing and natural language understanding. In natural language understanding, it isn't appropriate to get something right 70% of the time. You either understand something or you don't. And you can quite trivially show that GPT-3 will never achieve natural language understanding. I refer anyone who's interested to look at the work of Walid Sabah, who's published widely on the internet. You can find his stuff on LinkedIn very easily to show why that's the case. And it's a critique actually of all inferred neural network approaches to natural language understanding. There's a big barrier which people just will gloss over. Now, building on from that, I'd like to touch on something that Guy mentioned earlier on, where he mentioned the ability of of AI, and these are typically neural network engines in practice, to, I use the word creating scarecrows because it isn't obvious to me they're doing any creation over and above throwing some random numbers in the air, but that's a separate debate. But the ability of AI to create and interpolate in the style of Rembrandt, or musically to interpolate Bach's canon and produce new audio output that superficially sounds like Bach. I was blessed by working with a guy for one time, sadly departed now, as one of the great cellists in the country, and he said, yeah, but Bach's genius was knowing when to stop sounding like Bach. And it isn't obvious to me that these neural network programs can do that. And generalizing from it, I once asked a question to Jürgen Schmidhuber, one of the fathers of deep learning, at a conference, where Jürgen was saying, in 10 years, I will have an AI that can create as well as Shakespeare. And I thought, I'm not convinced by this. You might be able to get your work to create images, for argument's sake, that exhibit certain superficial similarities with those from Rembrandt. But when will you create a new pissoir, a new urinal in the style of Duchamp, or bringing it more up to date, a work of art like Tracy Emin's Unmade Bed, something that goes outside the current paradigm? Now, it seems to me that these questions go fold back to the question I first raised, that can we get AI to replicate all aspects of human mentality, and can we get AI to seamlessly transfer knowledge from one domain to the other? My own intuition is that we can't. And given that, it's going to be and because AI doesn't understand anything about the domains in which it's operating, and because of that, it can't engage in artistic practice in the way that Tracy Emin and Duchamp can, and therefore it's always going to be lacking. And these issues I don't feel are discussed enough. I just feel there's too much acceptance of advertising talk from the big tech manufacturers.
I think that, Daniel, you've got some views here because you've been messaging me, but I'm reminded that we've got 5 minutes to go just for everyone's information. So Daniel, if you can just bring a perspective of being both, in academia and in industry, and then I'll ask the panel for their one priority to conclude.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as a part-time academic with Cranfield, this is something I wrestle with a lot. Natural language processing, as an example, uses a lot of different transformers. And one of the sort of, big step forwards that happened in recent years was the development of the BERT type transformer. And it enabled us to really step forward in some of our natural language applications. But that step forward happened just a few years ago. As an academic, how do I keep up my courses so that I am teaching these topics that are evolving so rapidly that my course is out of date after 1 or 2 years? And I wouldn't, like to think that I have a solution for this. It's just one of those challenges that you have as an academic, is really understanding how you continue teaching the foundation topics while also being able to touch on some of these advanced leapfrogging topics that are hugely important, particularly when the students go on to work in organizations like Adaga, where we have a need to apply cutting-edge, state-of-the-art technologies. And in the interest of time, I won't touch on that any further. I just wanted to put the thought out there.
Thank you, Daniel. And on the skills and education side, it is pointed out in the roadmap that we need AI literacy for everyone, new courses, new apprenticeships. We're pointing out there is now a level 7 AI specialist apprenticeships that was released 6 months ago, which is truly pioneer. So there's quite a lot going on, which is great. So to conclude, let's pretend I've got a magic wand and I can make one wish happen or one priority. I'm just going to ask each one of you what would that wish be. So John, let's start with you. What's your priority? What's your wish?
So I'm gonna pick one from the skills space, because another part of my life is I'm co-founder of an organization called computerbasedmath.org, where we've been arguing for some time that the math subject we teach in schools is just fundamentally the wrong subject. Yes, it's true you can learn about things like AI online, but the core curriculum subject is teaching a historical subject at the moment, teaching people to be bad computers rather than good problem solvers. The one thing that this non-general AI can do is be a good computer. If you look at my daughter studies history. In history, she studies things that happened in my lifetime. In physics and biology, she's studying things that have been invented in my lifetime, almost with geography, where plate tectonics is only just before my lifetime, whereas nothing she learns in maths is anything that isn't 100 years old. And there are so much more things that we could be teaching that assume the computer exists rather than training people to be hand calculators using pencil and paper. It's the one compulsory subject apart from your native language for pretty much everyone, and yet it's the least relevant today for preparing for the AI age. So we've been thinking about what a new curriculum would look like for that, but I wish the UK government would talk to us properly about it.
So, Guy, what's your wish and your priority? So quick fireside answers now, because we've got 1 minute to go.
I think it comes back to what you said, Raoul, about literacy. I really think we need the country, everyone, like a vaccine rollout, to understand why artificial intelligence is important to them. Because without that, you have to have a predisposition of interest to then want to go and study it. But actually to understand how it works in every business, from pottery to through art to mathematics and sciences, is what we need to do. Simple literacy. Great.
Mark, what about you?
I'd like people to, if they have 5 minutes, to reflect on the provocative title of a very recent paper by me called Artificial Intelligence is Stupid and Causal Reasoning Won't Fix It. What makes me think artificial intelligence is stupid, or what makes anyone might come to that conclusion?
Great. Sounds like there's a team here in the wishes. Education is quite top on the list. So Daniel and then Monica.
Yeah, so very quickly, I think that diversity is hugely important. So that's both the sort of cultural diversity that we normally sort of associate with the term diversity, but also technical diversity and application diversity. I think we need people who are not just AI specific, but we need people who've developed and used AI across a broad number of topics.
Great. And Monica?
Just to follow on, really, I mean, I think we need to lead ourselves into the future. I agree around the skills agenda and the cognitive diversity elements, so that we can invest in training and development so people can hone their ability to exercise good judgment as to whether AI is good or whether AI is stupid. And then perhaps when trusted AI exists, that is when the transformative power of AI will be felt.
Thank you. So I just want to say a big thank you to the panelists. Really grateful for your time today. It's very much a healthy and interesting conversation. And I will hand over back to you, Zara.